Te lo puse todas alemanas que tienen un...
Sí, las, ¿no?
Pues exactamente, yo no sé ni cómo se pronuncia. Con torta y refresco, con torta y refresco, incluye. Buenos días, tengan todos ustedes. Les pido tomar asiento. Para comenzar el día de hoy recibimos a la hermana Helen Alford, quien es vicerrectora de la Universidad Pontificia de Santo Tomás, a menudo llamada Angelicum, en Roma. Originalmente se formó como ingeniera de manufactura en la Universidad de Cambridge, Reino Unido, y su tesis doctoral se refirió a la tecnología centrada en el ser humano y su potencial para la humanización del trabajo en la manufactura. Sister Helen, welcome to UPAEP, and thank you for being here.
Well, first of all, I would like to say what an honor and a delight it is for me to be here at this conference. I think it's a very, very interesting project, the IPBC project. In fact, I would say I think it's one of the most advanced in the world today on this topic. And since I've been able to be here and see the cultural background of Mexico and learn something about this university, I really can't think of a better combination of culture, university, and topic. To me, it's really providential that this project is running in here. And I am really sure that you will produce something that's very important for all of us. You know, you can make some progress that it would be more difficult for the rest of us to make. So at the beginning, I would really like to congratulate Matthias, Tonio, and all the other people who've been very involved in carrying this project forward. It's really a great achievement. And I also like to apologize for not speaking in Spanish. I'm living in Italy, so I can speak Italian okay, but Spanish is a bit difficult for me. So I will go slowly, and I thank you very much for your patience with me. So the title calls for reflection on the contribution that a common good approach can give to development. And so I would like to, as we say in English, I'm sure coming from Spanish culture, I would like to take the bull by the horns and say that the most important thing about what common good thinking can give to development is to help us recognize that we are between metaphysics and history in our life. That common good thinking has often been accused of being unhistorical, of floating in the air, of not being connected with development, you know, of even being totalitarian in trying to program where we should go. Now that's partly because people have been explicit about its metaphysical grounding, and also because they don't always necessarily defend this grounding in the most expert way. So sometimes the criticisms are fair. So it's very important that the IPBC project rightly recognizes that if the common good is to make a contribution today, it must be operationalized, it must be used, it must be enacted must be living, working. But a look at development thinking today, I think, shows that a lack of an explicit metaphysics creates problems. And we will look at this a bit more in a moment. We tend to focus, for instance, on how to do things, on how questions, not on the why and what for. That is just what each one of us individually should decide. We find it hard to articulate shared final objectives. An integral vision of development is hard to imagine. So we know what we want to do, but we don't really know where we want to go, or we're afraid of articulating this because of the way we think, because of a fear about metaphysics, I think. So I would like to situate the relevance of the contribution that common good thinking can make to development in this tension. We talked about tension yesterday. In this tension between metaphysics and history. And I think it's a kind of leitmotif of this talk. So first of all, I would like to say something about development thinking today. We are in a context where development is seen, first of all, through the lens of the 2030 Agenda and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. This agenda, as I'm sure you know better than I, is the result of a long process that in many ways is a really remarkable achievement. I think that's the first thing we want to say. It's amazing that we've got to this point. However, we will make some criticisms of the agenda in a moment. And in order to help us, I think I'd like to focus on two key elements in this agenda: the gradual adoption of the idea of sustainable development and the concept of human development. So the first of these two ideas, sustainable development, to be launched in official circles is sustainable development. This is the first one that arrives through the Brundtland Report, the 1987 report. However, when it was first launched, it was not at all sure that such an idea could become central to the development agenda. Economically poorer countries were immediately concerned that their efforts towards economic growth would be compromised, while mainstream economists argued that existing market models were the most effective and efficient method to bring us to the desired levels of development. Then in 1999, the Millennium Development Goals focused on poverty reduction, an important change in the focus of development, and created the approach of agreeing a number of key, very symbolic, meaningful goals and targets behind them for demonstrating progress in the direction to be made. Now, according to the book Negotiating the Sustainable Development Goals by Dodds and a few other people who were directly involved in doing it, it was in 2010, in response to a questionnaire sent out to all governments to prepare the Rio+20 meeting in 2012, so a meeting about environmental questions, that Paula Caballero of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Colombian government, so from this part of the world, articulated the two principles of the subsequent Sustainable Development Goals, that both economic and environmental factors are essential in resolving social problems, and that objectives for sustainable development had to be applicable to all countries. Not surprisingly, also this idea, the Sustainable Development Goal idea, immediately met opposition. Countries that had invested in the Millennium and Development Goals did not see the value of them and feared the loss of aid in the poverty-reducing directions. Aid agencies were set up for funding the MDGs, and some saw the changing of the agenda as a distraction from the focus on poverty. But the idea had inspired enough key people and enough effort was put into promoting it so that the first draft document for the Rio+20 meeting, which came out in January 2012, included the idea of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Rio +20, as Dodds and his colleagues say, became a staging post on the way to the post-2015 development agenda, insofar as it forged the link between environmental protection and human development. So the idea human development was also launched before this 2015 agenda, a bit later than sustainable development, in 1990 with the Human Development Reports. The new Human Development Index was a symbolic triumph. The report's initiator, who was mentioned yesterday, Mahbub ul Haq, correctly understood that an alternative indicator to GDP was needed to rival it, to have any chance of drawing attention to the human development agenda, to push a development away from purely economic development towards human development. But the main 1990 report did not describe human development in the same terms as the index measured it. The report overview began with this text. It's a very important text for us to read together. Human development is a process of enlarging people's choices. First phrase. Second phrase. The most critical of these wide-ranging choices are to live a long and healthy life, to be educated, and to have access to resources needed for a decent standard of living. And then the third phrase. Additional choices include political freedom, guaranteed human rights, and personal self-respect. So these are the opening 3 lines of the first Human Development Report. This phrase, or these 3 phrases, show that the idea of human development was not resolved between 2 positions amongst the team writing it. There was a liberal one, which was the dominant one, in which the key element is choice. Every phrase here has the word choice in it. Human development is a process of enlarging people's choices. The most critical of these wide-ranging choices, and then additional choices. So the word choice is the most present, the most powerful idea in this definition. But there's also in these first 3 lines, a substantive or normative definition of human development, which starts coming in the second phrase and carries on in the third phrase. Things like a long and healthy life, to be educated, to have access to resources for a decent standard of living, political freedom, guaranteed human rights, personal self-respect. And then we have the third phrase, which is the most extraordinary phrase I think I've ever read in any of these documents, which tries to put these 2 definitions together by saying additional choices include political freedom, guaranteed human rights, and personal self-respect. So can we really characterize guaranteed human rights as an additional choice? This is really extraordinary attempt to try and put 2 very different definitions together. And in fact, the subsequent human development reports did not resolve this tension. So these are just to help us see that there have been very big steps forward made in terms of thinking about development in the last 20 to 25 years. But some problematic elements remain. One of the recognized difficulties with the Sustainable Development Goals, since they were agreed and since people have been thinking about them subsequently, is the integration between them. Because despite all the efforts made to come up with an integrated agenda, it still remains quite fragmented. Each goal has its own logic and its own targets, which have been affected by the jockeying between interests in arriving at them. At least potential contradictions exist between them, such as the goal for decent work and economic growth, number 8, and the goal for climate action. The hope is, of course, that these tensions can be resolved in via as we try to move towards this agenda. But still, this is not the same thing as being able to explain the unity between the goals on a theoretical level. There are other efforts to create integration, such as the universally agreed 5 transversal dimensions: people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. And there's actually a goal, number 17, which focuses attention on creating the partnerships needed to achieve the goals. So there's a lot of attention to practical integration, to integration on the level of the operationalization of the agenda, which of course is rather important to a project like this, looking at the operationalization of the common good. Now this problem, lack of integration, is even more striking given the realization that integration is needed in our thinking. This is very widely noted in the literature and on a practical level. For instance, in the paper that preceded the current one, the 2017 IPBC paper, it pointed out quite clearly that there has been interest specifically in the idea of the common good for quite some time now. The need to move away from or beyond individualism is particularly widespread, but we can see we have difficulty to achieve it. So even though we know we need to change this, why is individualism so fixed in our thinking when we know we need to overcome it? And there are lots of people trying to do that. So I'd like to say something about why I think individualism is here, and that might help us then go beyond it. So the rise of individualism is a complex story described by several important thinkers in recent years, such as Larry Siedentop. And only some of this story is opposed to thinking on the common good. The recognition of the dignity and value of each person, which can be traced back, in the West at least, until the early centuries of Christianity, would be central to common good thinking. At the same time, individualism as an overall theory represents a kind of partial truth, we can say, useful in dealing with some types of problems, but overall, as something partial, it can be misleading. Although we can see its beginnings in the ideas of William of Ockham on free will within the medieval period, it starts its modern development in the 18th century for a number of reasons. One is the intense violence that had engulfed Europe in the religious wars of the 17th century following the 16th century Reformation. Thinkers searched for ways of understanding society that could help prevent such violence. The idea that individuals should be free to decide what to believe, with a clear distinction between a private sphere where belief could reign and the public domain where rule of law and proper procedure held sway, seemed to be a possibility. So emphasizing the private freedom of the individual and the legalistic, dispassionate sphere of the public square became a way to address the problems society was facing at the time. The partial truth of individualism seemed to work in relation to such a problem. Then we have other factors as well. We won't talk about all of them, but just mention some that are particularly relevant to us. Economic developments were also pushing against traditional ways of running and organizing economic activities. Just as the political or public sphere was freeing itself from traditional influences, so the economic sphere was freeing itself from the social expectations and traditions of the past, where landlords and peasants had responsibilities towards each other. Whilst there had been inequalities in the pre-capitalistic system, there had also been mutual obligations and benefits. The drive towards loosening these social bonds became even stronger with industrialization. The poor were driven to the new centers of mining and manufacturing, where the mill owners established purely contractual relationships with them. For both parties, their relationship was financial and contractual, and there was no sense of any shared goals or any common good. Now, since most people were still very poor, developments like these that promised to increase economic output, even if they represented a threat to the social protection of the most vulnerable part of the population, were still likely to be successful. In some ways, today's gig economy represents a similar dynamic. There's a lot of freedom on both sides, but the insecurities that workers face can leave them very vulnerable. The rise of capitalism provided a chance to raise the living standards of whole populations, but not without a cost. One of these costs was the positioning of economic questions at the center of social life, such that all issues became, first of all, a question of resource creation and allocation. All more substantial ends, such as a good life or personal development, became relegated to the private secondary sphere. Now, we could mention other factors, like, for instance, the rise of modern science. But I hope it is already clear that thinking about the human being as an individual, around which the widest possible space should be created so that he or she can act freely and choose what she wants to do, was encouraged by the situation that faced 18th century Enlightenment thinkers like Adam Smith, John Locke, David Hume, and other people of this kind. So they abandoned the idea of any shared goal for human beings that could be discerned from their shared nature. Freedom became associated with free will, the possibility to choose from the widest range of options possible, and we still see this in that definition of the Human Development Report that we just saw. Reason also became a kind of rational calculation, detached from the embodiment of the human person, leaving emotions and physicality behind in a kind of dark, non-rational backwater. In some ways, we could say that what we witnessed at the time of the Enlightenment was a kind of breakdown of the integrated view of the human person that had included individuality but was not limited to it, and which had reached the peak of its development at the end of the Middle Ages. This breakdown in thinking brought problems that have become acute for us now, but it also brought advantages on the political and economic levels. Focusing on the individual put the social context, or the whole, or the system within which we act in the background. This had the advantage, for instance, of simplifying theories and allowing thinking to focus on specific acts of life at a time when society was changing very fast under the impact of the emerging capitalist industrial system, and new knowledge was needed. From the 1700s through to the 1900s, we see whole new areas of thought developing, with new subject areas establishing themselves, such as economics, political science, sociology, and psychology. But specialization represents a problem as well as a gain. Losing sight of the overall picture, university disciplines and experts in general become less able to use the advances in their fields in the resolution of real, multifaceted, and integrated problems. As the joke goes, the difference between an academic and a management consultant is that the first knows more and more about less and less, and the second knows less and less about more and more. Both suffer from the inability to make progress in regard to systemic social problems. Problems and solutions can only be seen within the silo of the specialism. So, our modern way of thinking has been formed by answering questions posed about human freedom and by adopting an approach of specialization. But this kind of thinking is no longer fit for purpose, because the problems we face are different from the ones they faced in the 18th century. We face social and systemic problems. Among these, social exclusion and environmental degradation are emblematic. We need an approach that does not absorb the individual, but that roots individual freedom in the social good. When we think about operational issues too, We need a theory that is not too complex and that allows us to go forward on a practical level. And this is where I think common good thinking can really make a contribution. And this is where we come back from history to metaphysics again. The metaphysical theory that integrates the practical initiative that I will present to you after this bit of theory, it's called Blueprint for Better Business, is the personalism of Jacques Maritain. Quite simple. For academics, would be probably not very serious, but I have to say practical people like business leaders, those involved in Blueprint, find it helpful. So it's a way forward for people who need to make changes, who want to operationalize a different way of thinking. In their case, business, but it could be applied much more widely. Maritain discusses how a human being can be both an individual and intrinsically relational at the same time, through these two integral yet distinct aspects of being human. In his understanding of the human being, there is a distinction between and unity of two dimensions of that being. One dimension is individual and the other is personal or relational. Now, we are used to talking about two dimensions of the human being, but we usually use terms like body and soul, or matter and spirit, something like this, distinguishing between a material and an immaterial aspect. In the personalist view, the way of thinking about the soul or the spirit is slightly developed or modified, for this part of our being is seen to be intrinsically relational. That is, where relating to others is part of who we are, not only useful to us in obtaining what we need as individuals. Our individuated dimension, linked to our physical body, fixed in time and space, only relates to others insofar as they are useful to us in gaining what we need. So on this level, individual level, we are instrumentally relational. That is, our relationships are useful to us for gaining what we need. The individuated or physical side of the human being is needy and fragile, often in competition with others to satisfy its needs and forming relationships so as to achieve its individual objectives. So we need to recognize this individual dimension of the human being, since it is realistic to do this. And furthermore, it allows us to build on existing thought, for we really are in competition with each other at any one time for material goods and money, and we do have individual survival objectives. The relational or personal dimension, which is the spiritual or non-material aspect, is instead constantly transcending itself, looking for relationships because they are good in themselves, not especially because they are useful to each one of us in achieving individual objectives, even if they may also be useful for that. Insofar as we are persons, we find ourselves in relationships which are common goods between us. It is with others in our relationships, of which friendship would be the most obvious and a particular kind, that we search to achieve goals and objectives, build a life together, grow together, so that our relationships become part of who we are, not just useful to us in achieving individual goals. The happiness research, for instance, shows that our sense of well-being and contentment is much more connected with the quality and depth of our relationships than it is to material possessions or status. So, in some areas of our lives, such as our families, we tend to think more about our relationships, and in other areas, such as in the workplace, we tend to think about our individual goals and ambitions. What we often do not recognize is that all our relationships have an individualistic, contractual side and an intrinsically important side. In other words, in everything we do, we are operating as individuals and as intrinsically relational beings, as persons, at the same time. Now, This idea may seem a bit strange. We're putting two contradictory things together. But we should remember that there are other theories that do similar things. Perhaps the most famous, the most well-known, is the theory of the wave-particle duality of light. There are some experiments that physicists have done that they can only explain if they think of light as a particle, while there are others, when light bends, that they can only explain if they think of light as a wave. We cannot get to a more simple explanation of what light is. We can only say it displays the characteristics both of a particle and of a wave. In his writings, Maritain uses other analogies. For instance, he uses the example of a work of art, which is at one and the same time a material object made up of various chemical substrates and a source of inspiration and enlightenment to us. Games are full of competition, but only work if the players cooperate with each other by keeping the rules. And the whole idea of sportsmanship goes beyond adherence to rules. In all these examples, things that seem contrary, a particle and a wave, an individual and a relational being, cooperating and competing, so things that seem completely different, are found at one at the same time in the same object or activity. Now, recognizing the intrinsically relational side of the human being is key to finding solutions to the problems we face today. All the research that is renewing the idea of the common good focus on relationships between social actors and other areas of life, such as economic and environmental. Corporate social responsibility, for instance, corporate citizenship, shared value, stakeholder theory, sustainability, all these widely used terms in business, for instance, focus in some way on the relationship between business and society or environment. But as we know from experience, these ideas often do not get us very far. All too easily, they succumb to a process that we could call hollowing out. We carry on using the words, but they've lost their meaning. A good example of this is how CSR has become a rather worn-out and hackneyed term, and mentioning it to business people can often elicit a cynical response. For some companies, it really does mean something, but all too often, it has become a fig leaf for covering over what is otherwise just the same kind of business as usual. The same kind of thinking that sees the human being as individualistic and self-interested would also lead us to think that CSR and all its cognates are nice ideas and may do some good, but they can't really change the way business operates. The best they can do is to put a kind of veneer over the top of it. The cynicism of many as regards CSR is probably justified unless we go deeper, unless we ask ourselves more profound questions about the relation between business and society. With the idea of the human being in two dimensions, individual and intrinsically relational, we are able to think differently about the common good too. We can create goods between us as part of our intrinsically relational side, which are held in common between us. Since relationships can be intrinsically important to us, part of who we are, we can work towards genuinely shared objectives as friends do, from which we both gain something individually, but more fundamentally, we both gain together. Friends each benefit from their friendship. It would be a very odd thing for one friend to say to another, "Give me all that's mine in this friendship." That would be a kind of act of aggression, and unless the friends could patch it up, would lead to a breakdown of the friendship itself. Friendships either exist between friends or they don't exist at all. And only on the basis of their shared friendship do the two friends gain individually from it. Now, this happens in business and in wider society too, when we are working towards common shared objectives. When different groups cooperate together in different ways in a business, for instance, employees, investors, suppliers, customers, and so on, it is only on the basis of what they achieve together, the success of the business itself, that they can each get something out of it individually. perhaps career advancement, or return on investment, or more secure custom, or better service, or better pay, or whatever. So when we are dealing with each other, even in a business, we are creating a common good together, on the basis of which we can each gain some individual benefit too, which usually includes some financial reward, but isn't limited to that. Wherever people are acting or working or cooperating together, they are producing common goods, and all these shared goods, in a wonderfully varied and articulated way, build up into the wider common good of societies as a whole. So, with these thoughts in mind, I would like us to move to another example of operationalizing the common good, which tries to pick up many of the same themes that the IPBC project has done, but which so far has focused on business, even though the approach can be extended to wider groups in society. So Blueprint for Better Business started in London after some leading business leaders had read Caritas in Veritate, not all of them Catholic. And they went to the Archbishop to ask for his help in dealing with the massive loss of trust in business as a result of the financial crisis. They realized that business needed to reconnect to the wider society and that they could not do this themselves. The approach that developed, however, as we've said, is not only applicable to business. The name of the charity or non-profit that was set up in 2012 to develop the Blueprint approach was simply called the Blueprint Trust, so as to leave open this possibility. And indeed, some of the most challenged city councils in Britain, such as Liverpool in the northwest, are interested in using the Blueprint tools. So I have maybe 10 minutes, I think. Yeah, so I will just show you. You can't read the words, but you can see the shape. This is the first tool which was developed within the Blueprint framework. It's developed for business. Remember, we're talking about between metaphysics and history. So if we were going to do something for city councils or other actors, we would probably change this a bit. This is a tool to help business people, but you can see, oh, thank you. You can see the beginnings of what could also be applied to other organizations. The way a blueprint works is primarily to start in the area where we said we are weak in our modern thinking. That is to ask the question why, the question what for, not the how question. Businesses are very good at knowing how to do things. There are lots of programs to help businesses implement something. They are much more weak on deciding why they are doing something. Okay, so the first part of this tool, the first horizontal part, is called defining purpose. So the word that's being used, which is used a lot now in the academic literature about business too, is purpose, business purpose. And we have two basic principles that the businesses keep in mind when they're thinking about their purpose, which is the dignity and value of people and the common good, promoting the common good, with the idea being that we need to keep in mind both the needs of each person but also the wider common good. Business is a social activity, it promotes social goods, common goods, but it needs to support the development of each person as well. So this is the basic framework within which each of the businesses are challenged to think about their purpose. And then we have a vertical part of this tool, which is called behaviors needed to build character and achieve purpose. And we can see here we've got 5 columns, maybe a bit like the pentagram, I don't know, slightly different words: solidarity, subsidiarity, reciprocity, plurality, and sustainability. So the idea here is that if we are going to achieve a purpose defined according to human dignity and the common good, we are going to need to work in a certain kind of way. We're going to have to change what we do in order to achieve a purpose of this kind. And changing what we do is not just about having a change program, which is what all the CEOs do, bring in some new program. It's also about helping people to change. It's about what we could call virtue development. So as we try to achieve this purpose, we are changing the business and changing the people at the same time. This is a principle that John Paul talks about in Laborem Exigens, when he says all work has two outputs, an objective output and a subjective output. We're changing the people as well as producing an output. So this tool is trying to get the business people to think about this. When we devised this, we showed it to some big business leaders and they said, there's something in this, we like this, but we don't know how to use it. So we had to do another stage, produce another tool, which is called the 5 Principles of a Purpose-Driven Business. And this tool, whereas the first tool came out more from the common good thinking and the Christian social thought, this tool comes more out of the business thinking. But the idea is that it meets, there's a kind of a bridge between these two tools. It's the dialogue between the common good thinking and the business thinking. And this tool also has 5 parts to it, so we've obviously, there's some kind of parallelism here between the two projects. It's based on relationships, because business people are very used to thinking about stakeholder analysis. Who are our stakeholders? Who are we going to, is it okay? Who are we talking to? You know, so we have a 4-quadrant diagram, which is another kind of form that you see a lot in business schools, with a central piece, which is emphasizing again, we have to have purpose at the center of our business. And also we have 5 different relationships here. We have honest and fair customer and suppliers. We have a responsive employer, a good citizen dealing with the wider society, civil society and governments, and a guardian for future generations, so relationships with future generations. In the center, we have the investors. Why this? Well, because as we said, we're between metaphysics and history. Oh, thank you. Right now, these tools, which were devised primarily for the most difficult case to deal with, which is the quoted companies, the big quoted companies on the London Stock Exchange. Most of the businesses involved in this are part of what they call the FTSE 100, you know, the biggest quoted companies. They have to give results to their investors every 3 months. They're under very tough pressure to produce financial results. So given their situation, right now the investors are the most important relationship for them. So let's, deal with that situation the way it is. Put the investors in the center with the purpose. Okay? So connect the investors to changing the purpose and the relationship. So there's some thinking here trying to make this tool responsive to the situation it's dealing with. And the idea is that you can come into this blueprint thinking either from the side of the framework, which is what mostly the academics do. We also have interreligious dialogue thinkers who are working on this as well. So a lot of the thinkers come in on this side, and then a lot of the businesses start here. But then we're living in this tension, as we said, between metaphysics. We're trying to draw them closer to the framework. Also because we have this problem that we mentioned before of the hollowing out of words. If you look at business ethics, for instance, you see about every 10 years a new word comes in. 1950 it was CSR, 1980s it's stakeholder, 1990s it's corporate citizenship, 2000s it's shared value, now it's sustainability. What's happening is that the words don't change what happens, and they become empty of their meaning, and we have to find some new word. And so the idea is we have to keep pushing the business people to think about the meaning of the words. What are they actually doing with what they're saying? The word is not just a thing to help you sell the same way of doing business you've always used before. And then maybe there's lots of other tools. I just show you one other, which is about change management. And what I would just like to point out is that we have 2 sides of it. This sort of two sides always comes up. Like the human person has these two dimensions, we have two tools, two dimensions, the business, the structure, and the personal, and we try to keep that going through all the time so that people feel they're a bit in a tension all the time between these two poles. So you have three phases of this change: awaken, envision, and redesign. And then we have organizational change towards the top and people change towards the bottom. So the idea is that there's a reciprocal movement all the time. We're not just forcing some new strategy on the people, but the people are part of this. So this change is taking place on a human level as well. Anyhow, this has been used with quite a few businesses now. They've developed different strategic agendas. They use it in their various reporting. So it's gradually percolating out into the business sphere. I'm happy to talk to some of you afterwards. I'm sorry it's a business example in a talk about development, but because it's about operationalizing, I wanted to show it to you. And I think in some ways the business area is the most difficult one to deal with. And if we can break through in business, we can perhaps break through in other areas as well. So just to conclude, we said at the beginning that we are between metaphysics and history. Another way of saying that is that we are between thinking and acting, between theory and practice. The current theories behind our practices, focused on the individual and devised for a different age with different problems, are no longer able to provide, not able to provide the integral vision that we need for dealing with the social and systemic problems that we face. Common good thinking, when drawing on the personalist idea of the human being, provides a conceptual scheme that can recognize the value and importance of the individual, but goes further in recognizing the equally fundamental role of the intrinsically relational aspect of the human person. This key idea provides us with a way of linking the common good to existing approaches to economics, to other social sciences, and to development in a way that allows us to build, I think, on the current advances based on individualistic thinking, but also to move beyond it. I would say it does not represent a limitation of freedom, which of course has been the real concern of these individualistic theories, but a rethinking of freedom based on a more complete and realistic recognition of the human being that also takes into account results from genetics, behavioral economics, and neuroscience. The IPBC project, the Blueprint movement, and others that you know are all able to work because in one way or another they recognize these two dimensions of the human being in practice. And putting the common good into practice is what we really need right now. Thank you very much.
Muy bien, muchísimas gracias, Sister Helen, por esta ponencia. Tenemos unos 10 minutos de preguntas. Sí.
Thank you, Sister, for your talk. My question is, sometimes when we approach these schemes, we remain in this dichotomy between egoism on the one hand and altruism on the other hand. I think that's a consequence of an interpretation of the Christian doctrine, and it seems that either we are Kantian, if we look at the proposals of ethical codes in business, and we must do that because that's our duty and there is no reason for that further, or we are utilitarian in a comic sense, and we must strive after the greater good of the vast majority, but also in a self-denial way. And you know the consequence of that source of utilitarianism in authors like Singer, for example. So how could we change this mentality of egoism or altruism, or of self-denial or self-realization?
Podemos tomar quizás 2 preguntas y luego pues...
Just taking advantage, well, thank you, Helen, for your presentation. And taking advantage of Fernando's, it's a pleasure to see you, comment, I'll elaborate, I would like your opinion. I don't know if the blueprint model is also considering competition, the role of competition, because it's kind of the same, it's an analogic issue in terms of how the competition is considered towards generating common good as well.
Sister.
Okay, thank you for 2 very good questions. I feel like we have an understanding, and the questions are very well placed. Yes, egoism and altruism are 2 alternative positions that an individual can hold. If you only think of a human person in individual terms, with individual objectives, then the only way an individual can think about somebody else's objectives is to put on one side his or her own and take on those of the other. There isn't actually any way of sharing the objectives. There's no way of doing it. So this idea of altruism comes out of individualistic thinking and gets us into the trouble that you were talking about. And these are very serious thinkers, you know, the Kantian approach is, especially those coming from Germany, you know, is next to God, you know. I mean, much better, much better thinkers than I am, you know, but because they start from this individualistic idea of the human person, they are blocked to actually be able to see that we could share objectives. Now, once you can see we can share objectives, then we're in a completely different situation. For instance, we can deal with competition and the common good. Because we can say, like a game, we have to share certain things. We have to share a legal system, a way of life together, and inserted within that, the competition helps us improve our performance. A bit like the game idea, you know, the Olympic athletes compete with each other and improve the standard of the game, but only on the basis of the rules that they share. You know, this is all the problem of doping in sportsmanship. You know, people try to get the gold medal without being really the best sportsman, and that undermines the whole project. You know, so competition needs a kind of cooperation, otherwise it doesn't work. Cooperation is the basic element, and if you look at that's why the common good is the fundamental thing. In fact, none of us can really achieve our goals unless we live in a peaceful society, a society that can create the environment in which we can grow. So I think in many ways what I'm proposing here is actually very small change. It's not very important, it's not very big, it's not very revolutionary. We see it, we feel it, we know it. It's just saying something that we all know to be true. But it's very controversial in the academic sphere because it's not seen to be, you know, along the lines of the basic development that we've had since the 18th century, which has been, you know, seen as the best position that we've arrived at. And I think the way to answer that is to say, yeah, there was progress made at that time, but they made progress in relation to the problems that they faced. And all our thinking has to relate to real problems. We don't have the same problems they had. So we need to change our thinking the same as they changed theirs then, and not be afraid of it. You know, there's a lot of fear that we're going to have a sort of totalitarian takeover if we recognize our shared. I don't think that's at all. I think we can come to much better positions where competition and individual identity are important, but they're not the only thing. The theory can help us do what we want to do in the common good projects, in what we know we need to do in development. And we're trying to do these things, but with an unhelpful theory that leaves us not really able to say what we want to say. We have to talk about altruism instead of saying we're building a common good together. You know, and altruism doesn't really say what we're doing, you know. So, I hope I answered your question.
¿Otras preguntas? Tenemos todavía el tiempo para una o dos preguntas.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask you if you can give us an example for kids in education, yes.
¿Otra pregunta? Muy bien, pues entonces sobre los niños.
Yeah. Okay, so something about the formation of children. Yeah, well, I mean, there's a very famous example in the behavioral economics literature about giving incentives to children. Okay, so your parents, you have children, and you want to get your child to learn to be responsible, you know, to do something. Maybe to cut the grass, maybe to clean their room. It could be anything, you know. So they have to grow and become more responsible. So you could say to the child, if you clean your room or if you cut the grass, I give you, what would be a good sum in Mexico? In Europe, it'd be €5 or something like that. So, yeah. Okay, 20 pesos, right. So what happens? The child does the thing, but starts to do it as quickly as possible just to get the money, and doesn't care about the quality and just wants the money. And so the behavioral economists would say, you've driven out crowded out their intrinsic motivation to do something. If instead you say to the child, sit down together and say, we need each other. Our family stands and falls if we help each other, you know. So we need your contribution, just like you need us, you know. So let's decide what our jobs are going to be. So we all decide together, and they might decide to do the same thing. You might sometimes give the child 20 pesos as a sort of prize, as a recognition. But there's not this direct transaction. And what you're doing is reinforcing the common good between the family, that we go forward together, you know. And the child then feels proud. The child feels kind of involved, and the responsibility just comes from that. So you start to see small changes that you could introduce that make quite a big difference in terms of the relationships between people. And you can also see this in business too, if you stop using incentives in that way and start giving people a sense of contributing and being part of something that they can be proud of, you know, as well. So this has all kinds of applications. Yeah, thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Helen.
Agradecemos a la hermana Helen por su ponencia y hacemos entrega de un reconocimiento y presente a manos del doctor Matías Nebel.
Muchísimas gracias, hermana. Fue un placer tenerla aquí.
El Instituto Promotor del Bien Común ha desarrollado a lo largo de 3 seminarios de investigación internacionales una matriz de las dinámicas sociales del bien común. A continuación, me permito presentar al doctor Jorge Medina Delgadillo y al doctor Matías Nebel, quienes nos presentarán la matriz desarrollada por el Instituto. El doctor Jorge Medina es licenciado en Filosofía, maestro en Pedagogía y doctor en Filosofía por la Universidad Panamericana. Actualmente es asesor de proyectos estratégicos y contenidos de la UPAEP y miembro del comité del Instituto Promotor del Bien Común. El doctor Matías Nebel es doctor en Teología por la Universidad de Friburgo, director académico del Instituto Promotor del Bien Común y profesor investigador de Ética Social y Doctrina Social de la Iglesia en la UPAEP. Profesores, les cedo la palabra.
Le pido al licenciado Antonio Sánchez Díaz de Rivera nos dirija unas palabras.
En lo que Matías va a buscar sus lentes, aprovechamos para comentar algo. Bueno, nada más como una introducción, desde luego dejaré que ellos hablen. Ayer vivimos un bloque y hoy estamos en otro. Ayer hablamos del carácter pragmático y operativo del bien común y ahora la idea es ver la matriz y la métrica del mismo bien común en el bloque del día de hoy. Nada más quisiera, y creo que es el momento, porque luego ya en la tarde se desarrolla todo muy rápido, agradecer a Matías Nebel, pues el impulso que le ha dado al Instituto Promotor del Bien Común, con su investigación actualizada, con el buscar que efectivamente el bien común se operacionalice, por el networking que ha formado, y aquí un ejemplo es Helen Alford, que gracias por tu ponencia, thank you very much, Helen, for your lecture, y pues sí quisiera, pues casi que se le brindara un aplauso para que siga motivado en este trabajo. Y luego Jorge Medina, que voy a usar una palabra poco académica, hasta prosaica, es una persona que escupe ideas. Y pues ha hecho también una colaboración muy grande al instituto, y entre ellos pues han formado lo que ahora van a platicar, la matriz del bien común o el pentagrama, que ya desde ayer varios de los que nos han acompañado lo han utilizado. Pues adelante, por favor, doctores.
Antonio, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias también a la universidad. Es decir, eso es el resultado de un trabajo de muchos, ¿no? Es decir, obviamente estuve aquí, pues me dieron la oportunidad de liderar eso, pero sinceramente las buenas ideas se hacen con otras personas, es un bien común precisamente. Y pues quisiera este tiempo que me es atribuido aquí en este congreso, presentarle el resultado, ¿no?, de un esfuerzo de reflexión que fue compartido, trabajado, discutido a lo largo de 3 seminarios de investigación que envolvieron más o menos algo como 50 personas, ¿no? Es el resultado madurado, asentado de toda una reflexión, y pienso que es suficiente maduro para ser presentado hoy en día, pues de manera pública. La primera pregunta, quizás la más fuerte, la resistencia más fuerte, cuando empezamos a hablar de crear aquí una métrica o una matriz del bien común, una matriz para crear una métrica del bien común, es que todo el mundo levanta las manos al cielo y dice, ya tenemos mediciones, ¿por qué una más?, ¿no? Y por lo tanto el primer punto que voy a abordar es por qué es significativo una perspectiva de bien común hoy en día. Obviamente la conferencia de Helen Alford ha introducido ya algunos elementos, hablaré rápidamente de otros. Mi segundo punto está sobre, pues, devolver operacionalidad a la noción de bien común. ¿Cómo? Es decir, es una verdadera pregunta y una pregunta difícil. ¿Cómo devolver a un concepto retórico en su uso actual, pues un carácter práctico, pragmático, un carácter a partir del cual podemos medir el impacto de políticas públicas, analizar una realidad organizacional y otras aplicaciones? Y finalmente me extenderé hasta ir hasta la cualidad, cómo medir la cualidad de una dinámica del bien común, presentando la matriz a la cual hemos llegado. Quisiera salir con la primera parte. ¿Por qué adoptar una perspectiva de bien común? Pues quisiera salir de este punto esencial. Hay un fallo y un fracaso de 60 años, a lidiar con las formas estructurales de pobreza en nuestro mundo. La pobreza obviamente ha disminuido se ha transformado también, pero básicamente las formas estructurales de pobreza no logramos abatirlas de manera consecuente, duradera. Siguen en medio de nosotros. Y esto pues surge precisamente porque sabemos que gran parte de estas pobrezas son sistémicas, es decir, están directamente ligadas al funcionamiento habitual de un sistema social y por lo tanto son, cuando mejor funcione este sistema, más se mantienen estas pobrezas, ¿no? Y eso obviamente lo sabemos desde ahora bastantes décadas. Pero si bien lo sabemos, visiblemente no somos capaces de actuar sobre el sistema, ¿no? No somos capaces de abordar la dimensión estructural de esos fenómenos de pobreza. ¿Por qué? Porque en gran parte están en tensión con la comprensión teórica, en parte ideológica, que tenemos de nuestras propias sociedades. Una comprensión basada sobre agregaciones de individuos, sobre una agregación, para ser más precisa, de comportamientos y racionalidades individuales. La forma en la cual el concepto de Estado y de mercado existen hoy en día todavía de manera dominante es sobre una agregación para el Estado de ciudadanos. El ciudadano es una entidad mítica, ficticia, individual.